Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Hella Schwartz-Grossman, Marketing Manager at Worldox, and I am pleased to welcome you to today's special session for discussion on Worldox, Microsoft 365, and Azure. Before I get started, we just want to go over a few housekeeping items. The webinar will be recorded. The link will be emailed to you afterwards. Everyone is muted right now, but if you have any questions, go ahead and type them into the GoToWebinar questions field, and we'll address the questions at the end of the webinar. Our speakers today are Rebecca Sattin and Dan Paquette. Rebecca Sattin is the Chief Information Officer of World Software Corporation and part of the Alt founding circle. She has more than 25 years of experience in law firm technology and has spoken on topics such as cybersecurity, design thinking, collaboration, and deployment planning at bar associations, ILTA, legal tech, and other technology forums. Daniel Paquette is the practice manager of the Communications and Collaboration Group in the Infrastructure and Enterprise Systems practice of Kraft Kennedy. Based out of the Houston office, he provides technical expertise and leadership on engagements involving a broad range of law firm technologies, including Microsoft 365 technologies like Azure, Teams, Exchange Online, and security platforms associated with Microsoft 365. Join them today for a discussion on best practices for setting up your Worldox implementation in your Azure tenant. Thank you in advance for the attention you will be giving this webinar today. And Rebecca, it's up to you now.
All right. Thank you, Hella. So before I dive right in, I want to explain why we decided to do this webinar. Especially since COVID, since March, we have had a lot of inquiries from our customers who want to be able to work remotely. A lot of people were switching to Worldox Enterprise. A lot of people were asking about Worldox Web, which had come out about a year ago now, a little bit more than a year. And as time went by, a lot of people were starting to look towards migrating their data centers into Azure and using more of Office 365. So the more questions we got and the more that we had to answer these same questions repeatedly, the more I thought that it might be a good idea to just put on a webinar so that we can speak to all of our clients at the same time. So before we get started, we have a couple of polls. And Hella, if you could put up the first poll. We were curious about how many people are actually using Office 365 at this point. And let's see, we're getting some responses. And so far it looks like the majority, if you could go ahead and publish the results, looks like the majority of people are already using Office 365. And let's go ahead and put up our second question. The second question is more related to Azure and whether or not you're already hosting anything in Azure. And these responses are looking a little bit more balanced. Let's give it a few more seconds. But so far it's looking like most people, more people have not put anything in Azure yet, but there are about maybe, it looks like 39%, and you can go ahead and put up the results now if you want. So we've got 39% that have resources that are already in Azure. So that's a pretty good number, and I think you'll find the content today really helpful. So the first thing that I want to cover is the different subscriptions. Now, I hope you'll all bear with me, but Microsoft keeps changing their terminology and they keep changing what's included in what package. So I thought it was worth spending a few minutes going through some of this. And don't worry, because we will be getting to the actual meat that you're looking for, like what's required to put things in Azure and all of that sort of thing. But we're just going to go over some of this up front just to make sure everybody is on the same page. So Microsoft recently changed some of their subscriptions, and these subscription names are for generally under 300 users. Really, you can still have the enterprise accounts even if you're under 300 users, but you're only allowed to have 300 users on a combination of these particular plans here: the Business Basic, the Business Standard, and the Business Premium. And actually, Dan, if you could speak a little bit towards about the differences between them.
Sure, absolutely, Rebecca. So, like she said, there are 3 plans directed at the sub 300 market, 300 person market. The first one, the basic, is really intended at people who will not be heavy users of the Office application suite. So these are people who are not going to be using Word or Excel or Outlook, the actual applications that run in Windows. That's not to say that those folks don't have access to be able to work with Word documents or Excel documents or emails, but they would be doing so entirely in a web-based format. So that plan is very similar. If anyone's familiar with what Google Docs is, it's a very similar plan where Gmail and Google Docs and Google Sheets are all web-based platforms. This is Microsoft's product suite in that space. The middle tier is what most folks end up using. So this is for a standard knowledge worker, an attorney, marketing person, an accountant, anyone who generally does their work on a computer. It includes all of the storage platforms that the basic plan has. So you can have a mailbox in Exchange, a file repository in OneDrive and SharePoint, but it also gives you access to all of the Microsoft applications that we've all used for the last 20, 25 years. You can use Word and Excel and Outlook and PowerPoint and all of those. The final plan, the third plan there, takes this a step further and introduces some of the security platforms that go around the usage of the applications and the repositories that they store to. And they give you the ability to implement some tighter security. Intune has actually been rebranded again. It's called Endpoint Manager. That's about securing devices. Information protection is about securing documents. Conditional access is about securing access. Who can access your content from where? It's a staged platform. Different people in your organization, any combination of those licenses, but all 3 of them exist to meet the unique needs of the people in your organization.
Now, one of the things that I think is important to note about the Business Premium is I see Windows Virtual Desktop at the end of that list. So depending on what you plan on deploying, that might be an important component. So moving on, if any of you were familiar with the old style naming conventions, this is just a like how Microsoft has changed the names of the product. So while we used to have Office 365, now we have Microsoft 365. And if you'll bear with us, this gets even more confusing when we get to the enterprise products. Anything to add before we move on to the enterprise, Dan?
Not really. I mean, this is all being done because Microsoft is continuing to, develop new products and sort of align those new products into offerings, which all get new names. And this all just happens so fast that, yeah, it can be a trick to catch up with what the product is called today. But No, I mean that this is pretty standard in my world, and it's just a matter of keeping up with the names.
Yeah, and of course they did it in smack in the middle of April when, it's not like we had other things on our minds other than, wait, what is my Microsoft product going to be named today?
Yeah.
But okay, so moving along. So the enterprise products, again, you can mix and match the enterprise products with those first products that we mentioned. And in fact, for some Worldox products, you might actually need to have some combination thereof, specifically for if you're already using Exchange Online and you want to use our new email engine, then it's required that you have at least one E3 account for that. But these accounts have changed a little bit as well. Partially, these are, first of all, still called Office 365 instead of Microsoft 365, but there's another tier to them that's called Microsoft 365 that, just to make things even more confusing. And Dan, why don't you tell us a little about those differences?
So the three product tiers on the right, Office 365, E1, E3, E5, align fairly tightly to the Microsoft business licenses, basic, standard, and premium, all respectively. The idea here is that this is for the larger than 300 user market. These are priced a little bit differently than the business ones, and they do include a few additional services than the business licenses, which is why Rebecca's saying that for some of the Worldox products, you need at least one account with an E license just to capture some of that additional functionality. It is possible to buy just the applications separate. That's that left-hand column, and that is just access to use Word or Excel or Outlook or PowerPoint on your computer with no online storage, no online account that you can use to send email, things like that. I guess the only other detail here I'll share is Rebecca is correct. There is a superset of licenses called Microsoft 365 E3 and Microsoft 365 E5. I call them a superset because the Microsoft 365 E whatever license is a combination of these Office 365 E3, E5 licenses, the Enterprise Mobility and Security suite of licenses, as well as a Windows 10 Enterprise license, all licensed through the Microsoft Cloud Platform, all with one rate to it. If you're interested in multiples of those services, the Microsoft suite might make sense. Otherwise, you're probably going to stick to the SKUs that are listed here, and these will suit your needs.
All right. So moving along, one thing that I think also gets a little confusing is, especially for those people who are not necessarily, who don't have anything, set up in the Azure universe just yet. It's sometimes confusing to people what exactly is Azure and does it come with your Office 365 subscription. In part, your Office 365, I mean, it does come with a certain amount of, essentially identity provider. Excuse me. Azure can definitely just be an identity provider. And of course, if you're using Exchange Online, and you still have a local domain, you're going to want to make sure that local domain is connected to that to Azure Active Directory, which I'll come to again in a little bit. But so there's a lot of, essentially you can think of Azure as, if you wanted to put all of your stuff into a data center, you could think of Azure as your data center. The main thing about it is that even if you do put all of your existing servers into that Azure environment, it's still on you to manage them. It doesn't mean that Microsoft is going to take over managing them for you. If you have an IT provider who is helping you with your servers now, then you might want to speak with them because they may be able to continue to help you manage those servers in Azure. And just like when you have servers on-prem, you still need to worry about when are you going to put on Windows updates and all of those other good things. And Dan, do you have any pieces to add to this puzzle?
Yeah, the way I think about Azure, Azure is the broadest name applied to any technology that Microsoft runs in the cloud, right? It is any part of Microsoft's cloud technology platforms can be called Azure and that be correct. You can see in the slide here that there's a number of different types of services, and a lot of these interact with each other. The software as a service options, the Exchange Online or Teams solutions rely on something called Azure Active Directory, which is a lot like on-premises Active Directory, just hosted by Microsoft in the cloud. So there are a lot of cloud-based analogs to technologies that Microsoft has previously sold all of us, just run and managed by them. There are also storage and virtual machine platforms that you can move your resources to, your servers, your storage, what have you, to their hardware running on the internet that you have to manage, like Rebecca said. So it's a very broad topic. I have to be careful here. I could take the entire hour up on just this. I will not. But it is to say that Azure is sort of it's the underlying fabric that services all of everything that we call Office 365 and really any Microsoft cloud technology.
Thank you. So this slide is actually one of my favorites because this is the conversation that I tend to have with every single customer that calls in asking about migrating Worldox into Azure. We've had people think that they can migrate migrate Worldox. They have a server that's got Worldox running on it along with all of their Worldox data, and they just want to put that up into Azure along with their indexer, and they still want people to be able to use Worldox, back at their desks from home or from their office. And Worldox is really all about I/O, so that's not going to work, but we do have several other options for you that do allow you to run Worldox from Azure that we're going to get to. But some considerations about which option you choose would be relating to what other applications you have. If you solve the problem of how can I put Worldox in Azure, but you still have other applications in your ecosystem, like a time and billing system for those people still using maybe an Adorant or E3 or any of those products or Tabs and Practice Master, things like that. You don't necessarily want a solution that only solves a problem for one of your applications. You might need to look at something that's going to be a solution for all of your different applications. Another thing to consider is who owns the equipment. I know a lot of us had to, whether we had, a lot of firms had situations where, the lawyers have been able to work remotely for all this time and maybe have known how to do so. But suddenly, starting in March, we had to make sure that every single employee at law firms or at other types of companies who may not have previously been allowed to work remotely, all of a sudden, these people had to start working remotely. And depending on what type of a solution that people had, a lot of people were using RDP to get into their desktops at the office. Some people were using other sorts of solutions, but depending on what solution you choose, for example, if you were going to use Worldox Web, I love Worldox Web and I use it a lot remotely. But Worldox Web, when you open a document using Worldox Web or even Worldox Cloud or Worldox Enterprise, the document is getting copied down to your local machine. So if you have a situation where people are suddenly, using equipment that's not owned by the firm, you might want to come up with a different solution because you don't necessarily want firm documents to be, saved, even if only temporarily, on a computer that is outside the control of your company's IT infrastructure. So that's something to consider. Another thing to consider is, your hardware refresh cycle. Again, if desktop hardware is kind of getting long in the tooth, depending on what type of solution that you decide to provide, maybe now's the time to replace all of your desktop hardware with laptops for everybody so that, if we do have to have everybody working remotely, they're at least working on hardware that is owned by the company. And that way, if any data gets saved to that hardware, then it's not as big a deal and you can have more control over that hardware. You can make sure that encryption is turned on. There are all sorts of ways that you can control that with Azure, but that's in part another webinar, I think. So another thing, like typically pre-COVID, if somebody asked me about moving to any sort of cloud situation, whether it was moving to Worldox Cloud or moving all of their data into Azure and putting up some sort of other cloud solution, or even a solution outside of what I have already mentioned, there are plenty of different cloud solutions, cloud hosting providers out there. The thing that I would stress to them is their internet connections, because from the office, once you move all of your stuff into cloud, then it's great because you no longer have the expense of all of that stuff in your server room. You no longer have to buy servers. You no longer have to have any of that infrastructure anymore. But instead, you really need to invest in redundant internet connections. Now, all this kind of went out the window in March again because all of a sudden everybody started working from home. So with that in mind, one thing that we have come to realize, especially Worldox support, is that depending on what part of the country you live in, your internet connections are not created equally in different parts of the country. I am lucky that where I live, we have Verizon Fios, which means that I get a very high speed both upload and download. But in a lot of other places where we've spoken with some of our clients, in tech support, they might have a connection that's 100 down, but only 20 up or something like that. And that's fine for, depending on what you're doing. But since so many of us have been doing a lot more video conferencing lately, you just need to factor that in, that if video conferencing is going to be a part of your plan, something like 20 up, especially if you have, a family of 4 and, the kids are doing school online with video and the parents are doing, video conferences all day, 20 up is most likely not going to cut it. So I just usually include that in the conversation just because it has to be factored in when you're trying to decide which solution you're going to put in place. Now, before we get to moving servers into Azure, I just wanted to talk a little about some of our existing integration with Microsoft/Office 365. Like right now, today, if you have Worldox on premises, we have a send to OneDrive option and we have a checkout to OneDrive option that you can put in place. And if you're interested in doing that, we have notes on how to set that up in our knowledge base. A while back, we put together an add-in for Office 365 that we had a beta program for it. Now, the beta program was built against Worldox Web 2.x. When we started working on Worldox Web 3, we had to put that aside because we wanted to. Worldox Web 3 was a complete rebuild of the Worldox Web platform. And so as a result, the add-in needed to be retooled to work with Worldox Web 3. That is currently in development right now, and we have not forgotten about it, and we do hope that that will be coming out sometime soon. So that's something to look forward to. It does require the Worldox Web product, either traditional, which would be, you host it yourself, either in your office, in Azure, in, wherever it is that your data is being stored, or we can host the interface for you as well. And it also requires that you have an Office 365 subscription. So some of the things that the add-in allows you to do, it allows you to check files out to OneDrive. It allows you to create files in the online applications and then save them into Worldox, and bring Worldox documents into those online applications as well. So another thing that we have, and this is, it's not generally available right now, but it's in early release, is our Teams integration. And our Teams integration is really, I'm really excited about it because it gives you a way to share documents in a really organized fashion, and those documents can then be essentially all the security that comes with Office 365 and surrounds anything in Teams. That same security is going to control who can access anything that you share with people in Teams. So what I've got on my slide here is the right-click integration in Worldox that allows you to check documents out to Teams, or you can just share files to Teams without checking them out. I would use that in a situation where I was going to, for example, I'm trying to think, executed documents that you want to share with the client. If you just want to have essentially a portal available for the client so that they can access those documents at any time, you can set that up in Teams. If you're checking documents out to Teams, I would think you would use that essentially more for collaboration. So if you're collaborating with co-counsel or any other situation where you're collaborating with in-house counsel or something like that, you can check documents out to Teams, and then you can do some co-editing from within the Teams interface. Now, the beautiful thing about this is that when you're done working with a document in Teams, you can import it back into Worldox as a version, or you can import it over the existing document. So if you're interested in this, you can go ahead and email sales at worldox.com, and they can send you some more information and pass your information on to our development group, who can give you some information about how to implement this in your environment. We're hoping it will be in general release shortly. So I touched on this for a minute earlier, and I'm probably going to ask Dan to throw in his 2 cents, but I just want to make it clear that Azure Active Directory, which of course, if you have Office 365, you have Azure Active Directory, but it's not the same as Windows Active Directory. And Windows Active Directory, depending on how you want to implement Worldox in Azure, if Active Directory integration is something that's important to you, in certain situations it would be, which I'll come to in a minute, then you're going to need Windows Active Directory as well, which means connecting your Windows Active Directory, whether it's with a domain controller that's on-prem, to Azure Active Directory, or whether it means spinning up a domain controller in Azure, or both. And then Azure Active Directory directory services is in theory something that you could use if you don't have a domain controller, if you don't have Windows Active Directory. But the functionality of ADDS and Azure Active Directory is not really exactly the same as Windows Active Directory. So for the purpose of Worldox, again, if you're going to use Active Directory integration, you're going to want Windows Active Directory. And Dan, you can probably explain better the differences between them. And I know it's probably also, you could probably talk an hour on this, but
I'll put everyone to sleep if I talk an hour on this one. So Windows, I'll start from the bottom and shift around here. Windows Active Directory. That is the Microsoft directory service. So a directory service being the thing that keeps track of who we are as users, what groups we're in, the relationships to our various workstations, laptops, desktops, what have you, to the domain as a whole. Windows Active Directory is the original provider of that. It's been around since Windows NT, right? A long time ago. Azure Active Directory, the top bullet, is the cloud-based version of Windows Active Directory. And in moving it to the cloud, the amount of services and the amount of functionality that the cloud version provides is notably less than the on-premises version. A lot of that is because the cloud version is only exposing certain functionalities to all of us as admins and to all of the users that we support. It doesn't have to do as many things. And so based on that limitation, Microsoft has since designed the middle bullet point here, Azure Active Directory directory services, which is a way of retrofitting some of the more traditional Active Directory services and jobs that on-prem AD would do, and make those features work in a cloud environment. Now, like Rebecca said, you can potentially have just an Azure Active Directory augmented with Azure Active Directory directory services, which is a mouthful, without an on-premises if you were going for a cloud-only, no server type position. However, because on-prem Active Directory is necessary for Worldox AD integration, you almost certainly don't want to do that for Worldox, and more broadly, you probably don't want to do that anyway unless you're a very, very small organization.
Okay, thanks, Dan. So moving along, I think all of you probably know about Worldox architecture, so I'm not going to dwell on this for too long, but for those who may not know, I will just explain briefly. So Worldox Professional is our traditional Worldox software that has been around since 1988. Essentially, you install Worldox on a server, you have an indexer, and Worldox gets installed on each workstation and communicates directly with the copy of Worldox that's on that server. And it's very I/O intensive, as I mentioned earlier. So not a good idea to just put Worldox Professional and your indexer up in Azure and then mirror it down to workstations. That's not going to be a good experience at all. Worldox Enterprise, well, let me skip Enterprise for a minute and go directly to Cloud. So Worldox Cloud is essentially the Worldox Professional application, but we host it in our cloud, and we host it using terminal server architecture, and we present that cloud product, we present Worldox to you as a published application. There's some magic that happens also because we have a client component that gets installed, and the client component interacts with the locally installed applications and allows you to when you see the Worldox file list up on your screen, that's being published from terminal server as a published application. So basically, that processing is happening in our cloud. As soon as you double click to open a document, that's when the interaction between our cloud and that client component starts to happen. And it's transparent to you as the user, but ultimately when you double click on the document, it will automatically get checked out to your local machine. So this is one of the situations where, it depends on who owns the equipment, how you want to decide to handle this. We've had cloud customers that only allow the cloud client to be installed on firm-owned equipment. And in some cases, that means that during COVID, the cloud client is installed in their office and they still have people RDPing into the office to get to their data through Worldox Cloud because they've made a decision that they don't want Worldox Cloud being accessed from non-firm owned equipment. Now, Worldox Enterprise is the same technology as Worldox Cloud, but you put it in your own data center, whether that's a data center in your office or whether that's Azure or another hosting provider is up to you, but it's the same technology. So ultimately, it has that same challenge that you have to figure out whether or not it's going to be okay for you to, who owns the equipment again. That question keeps coming back up. So those are the three different types of architecture for Worldox. And I'll be discussing the first two and how you can put the first two options into Azure. So the first option, the first way of handling this is basically, if you want to put Worldox Professional in Azure, you're going to be doing that with something new called Windows Virtual Desktop. And it's not that Windows Virtual Desktops, the concept, is a new concept, but Microsoft just recently, in fact, Dan can probably tell me exactly how recently, came out with what they're calling Windows Virtual Desktop, which ultimately, instead of, in the past, we used to do terminal server or Citrix servers where you would have your people logging into a server architecture, and this allows people to log into a Windows 10 product, which, Dan, you can probably elaborate a little bit more on that.
Sure. To answer the first trivia question, it's about 45 days old. It was end of September.
Okay.
So this is super brand new. And yes, so this is sort of similar to a Windows terminal server, or for those who use the Citrix Zen products, it's a way of presenting a desktop to a user where the actual compute that desktop is actually executing is done somewhere in Microsoft's data center in the Azure platform. So it's we call it a thin client. You get a screen that looks like a desktop, but it is ultimately a thin client that is connecting to some other computer on the internet that is running your session. It will run your Worldox, your Word, Office apps. All of that's being handled somewhere on Microsoft's cloud, and you're just getting the picture to do your work off of.
Thank you. So ultimately, this is a solution that, especially I mentioned earlier, if you have, a time and billing system or various other products that you also want to get out of your own data center in your office and you want to host those in Azure, this is a perfect solution for that because you can still use Worldox Professional. You don't have to buy any additional licensing from us because you already own Worldox, and you can just basically, it's like any other server move, only you're doing a server move from your on-premises server up to a server that's in Azure. What I've recommended here, I've actually put some specs up here. And for those of you who have started to delve into Azure a little bit, I didn't want to spend too much time getting into this, but when you buy a virtual machine in Azure, they have different classifications of machines, and each classification has different specifications. So what I've assigned to this is a D4AS V4, which has 4 virtual CPUs and 16 gigs of RAM. Now, if you're a really small site, you've only got a couple of users, maybe like 10 or something like that, you could probably get by with putting everything on one server in relation to Worldox anyway. So you'd have the Worldox software, the Worldox data, and you could also run your indexer on that server. But if you're bigger than that, you might want to have one server that's going to host your Worldox program and data, and then you can have another machine that could either be a Windows 10 desktop or a server that would run your indexer. It just depends on exactly how big you are and your tolerance for, like, if you should need to reboot the indexer. If your indexer is on your only server, then that's a big disruption. So this is just one way of handling this, would be with putting Worldox Professional in Azure, and then also running virtual desktops out of Azure. And this is a great solution for those firms where everybody buys their own equipment, because all of the processing is done on these virtual desktops. So the next option, and this is a several slide section, putting Worldox Enterprise in Azure. Setting up Enterprise, I've actually included in the webinar a document that is also available in our knowledge base. It's available in the handouts section, and it's Worldox Technical and Enterprise Requirements, and it goes into detail about what the requirements are for running Worldox Enterprise. But remember, it's essentially a terminal server solution, so you're going to have all the infrastructure that goes with that. So again, you're going to have your Worldox indexer, which may or may not go on a separate server from your Worldox software and data. You're also going to need a Worldox Enterprise server, which could go on a Windows 10 machine or server 2019. And I've provided some recommendations for that. And depending on the size of your site, you might want to beef this up a little bit more, because we usually require quad core and 4 gigs of RAM. But Microsoft doesn't always, the specs of their machines don't always match up exactly with what your needs are. So you either have to, go a little over or go a little under. Now, let's see. So the other components for Enterprise, you're going to need Windows servers for all of your RDS roles. So, and I'm mentioning this, the team, our cloud and enterprise team, actually told me that if I'm going to be talking about this in a webinar, I need to make sure that if anyone plans on setting this up, our team is the one who actually sets all of this up for you. All that we ask is that you set up all of the servers that are required for this, and you make sure that they have all of their Windows updates on them, but do not set up any of the roles, because our team actually does that. When we connect, we'll actually set up the roles that go on the different servers, and then from there we will continue the setup of your Worldox Enterprise. For a small site, you could actually have a Windows server that hosts all of the roles, and you have to have enough remote desktop CALs licenses for all of your enterprise users. We usually recommend quad core and 12 gigs of RAM. If you're a larger site, or if you have concerns about redundancy, which frankly, I've worked in law firms long enough to know that downtime is not a thing that is acceptable. So having redundant session hosts is definitely something that you're going to want, especially if you're a larger site. And again, all of this scales up as you have more people. So this is at a bare minimum what we're talking about here. And our enterprise team, if you are interested in enterprise, our enterprise team would actually speak with you based on the size of your firm and the amount of data you have, and give you some advice on how to scale this. And the technical and enterprise architecture documentation also goes into that a little bit as well. So then the other thing that we need to discuss is, how are you actually going to access this environment? So Azure actually gives you several different VPN options. So if you want to access with VPN, there are several ways of doing that. And if you don't want to use VPN, then you have to make sure that you get an SSL certificate and have an additional server that's going to act as, it's going to have the gateway and the web roles, so that way you can basically separate that server from where your data is. But in terms of the VPN, actually I'm going to ask Dan to step in again and talk a little bit about VPN for VPN technology that's available in Azure.
Sure. So you have Microsoft's cloud, which is just servers that they run on the internet somewhere. That's all the cloud is. And then you have your on-premises environment that has a data center or a computer room in an office somewhere that has servers and switches and networks and firewalls and routers, all in that location. So the question is then, how do you connect the two? How do you make sure that even though your Microsoft Azure resources are physically not in your data center or office, how do you make it so that logically they can talk to your on-premises resources, your servers, your desktops, as if they were sitting in your data center or in your office? And so the answer there is a VPN, virtual private network. What a VPN is, it's an agreement between two firewalls that say we are going to exchange traffic with each other. We have a common way of encrypting that traffic so that traffic from Microsoft gets encrypted before it gets sent over the internet. And then when it gets to your firewall knows how to decrypt it. So it's like sending secure messages across the internet. And using this technology, you can connect your data center with your Azure tenant or Azure resources, and they can all talk to each other as if they were sitting right next to each other, even though they're very much not. So there are a number of VPN gateway SKUs that Microsoft gives you, and they all do the same rough thing. Really, the only difference between them is how much traffic can you exchange over them, and they charge. Obviously, the more traffic you retain to be able to send back and forth, the more they charge you for it. So the basic VPN gateway, and then there's VPN gateway SKUs 1, 2, and 3. For the traffic that we expect with Worldox, for the sizes of organizations that we're talking about, we would expect either the basic or VPN Gateway 1 to be sufficient. Obviously, if you had a much larger site in the thousands of people, then maybe VPN Gateway 2 would become more interesting to you. But for 1 megabit per user and the expected user counts, either basic or number 1 will suffice. There's a note in the slide that says don't go with ExpressRoute. So ExpressRoute's a little bit different than VPN gateways. ExpressRoute is a branding that Microsoft does in conjunction with WAN providers. And what that is, it's an SLA-backed WAN route that goes directly to Microsoft's data center. So what they're guaranteeing there is network performance and the latency between your office and Microsoft's data center. Typically for applications like Worldox, the benefits you would get from ExpressRoute really wouldn't play into the user experience. It wouldn't matter too much. So you're basically spending money for nothing. But what that would be useful for is if you were running a telephony service out of Microsoft's data center with Teams or some other application where the need to get the traffic from point A to point B in a very quick, very consistent manner has value to you. That's where ExpressRoute might be a product you'd be interested in. But for right now, we can skip ExpressRoute, look at the VPN gateways to join your tenant infrastructure resources with your on-premises infrastructure resources, and that's how you connect them up with a VPN.
Now, actually, I mean, the scenario that I'm talking about here is just Worldox Enterprise. But again, if you have other resources that are going to be going through that VPN gateway, then, again, you might want to, factor that in when you're making your decision, because I'm just addressing the Worldox part of this equation here. And you may well have other components that you're running through there. Okay, so moving along, Worldox Web came out a little more than a year ago, Worldox Web 3, and it has been maturing nicely with more features being released in every update. We just put out another update in the last couple of weeks that included the support for adding bookmarks, as well as a few other features and fixes. So if you wanted to add Worldox Web to the picture, then typically you'd have to add a Worldox Web server, but you'd also probably put your Worldox Web proxy server on your indexer. So again, if you were going to have an indexer that's doing double duty as your file server, then, depending on the size of your site, you might want to have those roles separate so that your file server is separate from your indexer and proxy server. And then you are going to want to have a web server. And I've put some specifications in terms of what ports need to be open, and you'd have to have an SSL certificate. And in this situation, in this scenario, this would be for people who are using Worldox Pro with Windows Virtual Desktop. If, again, you don't want to bother with the web server, we also have a hosted option where we could actually host the web server for you. But Worldox Web, the software itself, comes free to anybody that's got Worldox licenses. But then it's the software is free, but you still have to have the web server to put it on. If we host the interface, then we're going to charge, I think it's $10 a user a month for that. But that also means that at $10 a user a month, if you only have a couple of people that are going to be using the software, you could just license it cheaply for just those couple of people. Now, the reason why you might want to use that, even though you've already got this great solution that involves Windows Virtual Desktop, is partially because we have an iOS app. And if you've got people who are interested in using that iOS app, Worldox Web is a requirement for that. And then the other thing is Worldox Web just also makes it more convenient. It can be set up so that people can only view stuff. Like, again, if you've got a situation where people don't own the computers that they're using to access your system, you can set it up so that if they're using a computer that's not owned by the company, that they can only view the content through Worldox Web. And if they are using a computer that's owned by the company, then you can set it up so that it's got our Worldox Web agent installed, which intercepts the file open and the file save. So another option, and this is kind of a more radical option, and for companies that have a lot of users who I would call Worldox power users, it is possible that you can host Worldox in Azure. let's see. Okay, so this is just the Worldox web option. Sorry, lost track of what I was saying. So essentially, if you wanted to, you could still keep all of your stuff on-prem, but if you don't have the additional hardware to set up a web server, you could just put your web server for Worldox Web in Azure. And again, you just need to open ports that, open a port that connects your indexer, which has the proxy server installed, to the web server, and then port 443 and set up your SSL certificate. And you've now got Worldox Web with the web server hosted in Azure, even though you still have Worldox on premises. And again, I also mentioned that it's available as a hosted solution. I thought I was going to put in a slide for this, but I guess I forgot to. But so the radical solution that I started to allude to is just that you could set up Worldox in Azure and then set up a web server. And instead of going a Windows Virtual Desktop route, you could just have all of your users access Worldox through Worldox Web. The product is getting more mature as time goes on. It doesn't have every bit of functionality that the other Worldox deployment models have. But if your users are not power users, that might be a good solution for you. If you do have people who are power users who use every single feature of Worldox, then you're going to want to go with one of the other options that we mentioned. And I think I'm very amazed that we managed to get in all this content in an hour, but I do have time to stick around if anybody has questions. And I think I actually see one person put a question in about 64-bit support. And we actually do have 64-bit support for Worldox Pro, Worldox Enterprise, and Worldox Cloud. The 64-bit support is not quite as robust as the 32-bit support. You can still, you've still got your file open, your file save, but some of the additional options like the drop folders in Outlook are not there. But if you use our new email agent, then you can actually have link folders instead of drop folders. And again, that's kind of another webinar, but suffice to say that our email agent will integrate with the Exchange Online that is a part of Office 365. And using that, you can set up existing folders and connect them to Worldox such that anything that you put in those folders will either get copied to Worldox or moved to Worldox. So that would be a solution for the Outlook 64-bit problem. And again, you do have functionality with the other Microsoft Office products. It's just not quite as robust. Like we don't do the quick profiles and some of the other features that are on the ribbon bar. But we do have 64-bit support. Let me see what the other questions are. Can we use Microsoft 365 Business Basic if we already have licenses for Office 2016, but we want to move to Exchange Online and also use Teams, SharePoint, and OneDrive? And I think I'm going to defer that question to Dan, who knows more details of what's included.
So yes, you would be able to use the online repositories with the Office 365 basic license, so long as you were otherwise licensed for the client software, and you can manage those separately. That will work. Yeah, that should be fun.
Okay. The advantage and once you get to the point where you want to move to, whatever your next Microsoft Office suite is going to be, that's when you might want to change your licensing and just go with the full on, with one of the other tiers rather than, because I think Microsoft isn't it Office 2019 is the last one that they're going to allow you to buy as a standalone product? Is that correct?
Maybe.
That's a typical Microsoft answer.
Yeah, so far 2019 is the last version expected to have a traditional license purchase. They are moving as much as they can to the subscription model. We've seen that change. I will say one consideration to have in the model of using the Office 2016 stack with the Office 365 infrastructure, that will have a lifetime attached to it. Just recently, Microsoft did a declaration that they were no longer going to support Office 2013 client applications against any Azure backend. That's not to say they were going to administratively break them. They weren't going to cause them to not work, but they simply are not going to test 2013 clients against any of the net new changes they make in Office 365. So 2016, that doesn't affect you just yet. There will be a day and a time when 2016 is no longer supported. And again, everything will likely work the day after, but at some point you will start to see functionality become less than 100% stable. And you're hopefully off of that platform long before that happens. But you have enough horizon now that I don't think that's a terrible idea for the short-term future.
Okay. And I think I may have created some confusion earlier when I talked about needing an E3 license for Worldox. It's not that you need to have an E3 license for Worldox at all. It's only if you want to use our new email agent. So if you don't want to use the new email agent and you just want to go with all of the rest of the Worldox suite of products that you already own, I mean, you own the email agent. It's just a matter of whether or not you want to set it up. If you want to use the traditional email integration, then you don't need that E3 account. You just need the E3 account if you want to set up the email agent, because you need to have an account with permissions to all of your Exchange Online environment in order to crawl the mailboxes and monitor and move things to Worldox. And let's see. So somebody asked about Worldox Web and multi-factor authentication. So Worldox Web does have multi-factor authentication built into it. Essentially, you have the ability to turn that on and off through WD admin. And in fact, you can turn that on and off for Worldox itself through WD admin. You just have to have, so you have to be on, I think it's WDU 15 in order to have the two-factor authentication options built in, which came out in October of 2019. So if you're on that version or any version forward of that, then you should have the two-factor authentication options in there. Let's see. So somebody asked about including more features in 64-bit, and yes, that is on the roadmap. Those of you that have a more recent version of Worldox, when you update Worldox, all sorts of goodies have started to come down with your Worldox update. In your Worldox program folder, there should be a folder called modules. And one of the nifty new things that has become available is PowerPoint, a new PowerPoint add-in. And we're going to be moving more towards the add-in model with the Office products, which I think will give us a lot more of that functionality in the 64-bit products. But the PowerPoint add-in works with both 32-bit and 64-bit PowerPoint. And if any of you are frustrated with our integration with PowerPoint, I really suggest that you get on one of our more recent versions that comes with that add-in, because it just makes a huge difference. You can save PowerPoints as versions, and you can do all the same things that you've been wanting to do for decades. So definitely update and download that add-in. And I think that, let me check our time. We've definitely gone over a little bit. If there are any questions that we haven't gotten to, we will check the questions after the fact and get back to people. And I thank you, Dan, for joining us today to cover more in depth the details of Office 365 and Azure. And I also want to mention, actually, sorry?
I said thank you for having me. Good to be here.
You're welcome. And Dan works with Kraft Kennedy, and they are definitely known in the industry as experts on the Microsoft technology stack. So I was very happy to have him join us today and help me out with this. So thanks to everyone for joining us today. And if you do have any additional questions, you can always, I think everybody probably knows how to find me, but if you do have questions, you can always email them to sales@worldox.com, and they can get those questions to me. And okay. I thank you all for joining us. Hella?
Yeah, and yes, Rebecca and Dan, both of you, thank you so much for being part of the webinar today. It was a pleasure having you here. We are going to post a recording of the webinar, and we will also send out a link to everyone who did sign up. Anyone who did not sign up, they can still get to see it by visiting our website. And also, we wanted just to remind you that we do have a regular Worldox technology webinar series scheduled on Fridays at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. We started this series as a means to introduce some of our partners and provide them with an opportunity to share details about their applications and technology with you. And we hope you will join us for some of the upcoming sessions. You can register for any of them on our website. And we hope you have a great evening, and we'll talk to you soon.